question type are these level 3 question types, and I'm going to make a short video on each of these. So we'll start off with reliability. But for all three of these, the confusing thing is that these are still indicated as 2 times 2. So you mustn't expect to see times 3 to indicate that this is a level 3 question, but it is requiring you to think at a higher level, which is why they are level 3. These are synthesis and sort of deeper understanding type questions. So our first question type is reliability. And the thing that you must think about when you think about reliability is the trustworthiness of the source. And it really depends on what we want to know about. The same source might be reliable for one thing and unreliable for something else. When actual historians are doing work in the archives or they're looking at different books and reading about a topic, they have to say to themselves, can I trust what this person is saying? Can I trust that this primary source is accurate? And if not, why not? And the kinds of things that they will always think about are what we call provenance. And that word just means, where does the source come from? Who created the source? When did they create it? Is this a source that came from the time of the historical events, or is it a source that came from later on? And with who, we want to think about, is this someone who was actually involved? If they're actually involved, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were reliable, because they may have a very strong opinion about the thing, which might make them less reliable. But it might mean that they are an eyewitness, which might make us think that it is reliable. So it depends a bit. You have to think about who created the source. Do they have a reason for maybe exaggerating or leaving things out or not? You also want to think a bit about where. So in the example of the French Revolution that we've been studying now, a lot of these sources are coming from English cartoonists who were very critical of what was happening in France in the Revolution. So if we see that the cartoon that we're looking at is created by an English cartoonist, that's going to make us say, okay, that might make us doubt the trustworthiness of this as an objective source. And then sometimes we can find this out. It's not always easy to do this last one, but why was the source created? Political cartoons are an easy example, because political cartoons, it's always to try and shape someone's opinion, to make them think a certain thing. So we know that that's why a source was created. Sometimes we know it's maybe the source was written as a political poster or political speech. Sometimes it's a personal letter or a diary entry. And the reason that the person created the source would change the way that we think about whether we can trust it. If it's a diary entry that we come across, that person's more likely to be completely honest with their diary than they might be if they were standing up and giving a political speech. So all of those things, we can sometimes actually say enough about who or when or where or why to actually get 4 marks worth just from discussing that. However, if you want to then move on to the next way of thinking about these questions, the next sort of line of attack, you want to think about, does the source have biased language or imagery? So an example of biased language would be language that's very emotive, that brings out very strong emotions in the reader. It doesn't necessarily mean that the source is unreliable, but it does make us pause and think, okay, why is this person using such strong language? Are they trying to shape our opinion? Are they trying to make us think a certain way? So I'm going to just pause and think about that a little bit. This biased language is the only time when you're answering these questions in either level 2 or level 3 where you should quote. So you might want to, if you're going to say the source is not that reliable for knowing about the causes of the French Revolution or whatever it might be, because of the biased language, you need to back that up. You need to actually give me an example from the source, otherwise your answer isn't very convincing. Now, sometimes we're looking at a visual source, so I've been talking about political cartoons. So if you're looking at a visual source, you want to think about the imagery. Is the imagery that makes it seem very emotional? So we've got some dramatic imagery, we've got blood or guts or anything that's going to make us feel very strongly. Maybe, again, that's a reason why we might question the trustworthiness of that source. We basically are trying to think about, if we're thinking about a source being unreliable, has this person tried to manipulate our emotions in some way? Have they tried to change things to make us think a certain way? Or are they showing that they've got a very strong opinion, one way or another, that they are biased in their own understanding, which might make their reliability in being able to give us accurate objective information a little bit less likely. Maybe they're leaving something out because they have a strong opinion. Now, this last point is always your weakest line of argument. So if we're thinking about reliability rather than unreliability, we might actually not be able to say very much about these first 2 things and be really stuck for our last answer And in that case, you might want to do what we call corroboration, which says that it actually agrees with what other historians have said about the topic. Now, as I say, that is by far your weakest line of argument because you can't prove that. You're basically sort of saying, well, this matches what I've studied in class. And that's not a great argument, but if you're really, really stuck, that's a good last resort. The most important thing with this is that when you're answering these questions about reliability, you do actually need to answer the question. It doesn't help just to say, oh, well, here's some biased language and this person was from England. You actually need to explain why that would make the person either reliable or unreliable. An example of how this works in practice. So for our example, I'm going to use two different sources, one which we're going to say was unreliable and the other one which we're going to say was more reliable. So our first source is a cartoon, which is created here, and this is very important for understanding about how we engage with that question of provenance, where the source is from. So here we've got this description at the top, a political cartoon called The Radical Reformer by George Cruikshank, published in September 1819, an English cartoon on the Reign of Terror. Now, remember that little description at the bottom, the source, this just tells you where the person setting the paper got their source from, like where they actually accessed it. This is not relevant. So please don't say, oh, well, it was from a website, so it's a modern source, so it's not relevant. That's not what you should be looking at. You just want to have a look here. That's your important part. So we've got a couple of things we could look at here just from our description of provenance. And I could probably get 4 marks just from this, because I could talk about the fact that this is an English cartoonist, and I could talk about the fact that this cartoon is actually not from the time of the Reign of Terror. It's from 1819, which is much later. And there might be reasons why the French, at that point, they still actually have been fighting lots of wars with France after Napoleon. So there may be reasons why they were going to show this as an even more bloodthirsty period looking back. So we've got things we could say about provenance, and then we also have things we could say about the way that this cartoon uses emotive imagery. We've got lots going on. We've got blood dripping, we've got claws, we've got a guillotine monster, we've got a blade with blood. This is a lot of information. Remember that we might sometimes have a question that asks for the message of the cartoon as an explanation for 2 times 2, and then I could ask you how reliable is the cartoon straight after that. And you may find that you sort of copy across some of the same points, but that's fine. You're answering a different question. The first question about the message of the cartoon is asking you, what is this cartoonist trying to say? And then the second question is that a trustworthy thing, the information that they're giving? So let's take this first thing. When we're thinking about a source that we think might be a bit unreliable, we're saying, okay, where does it come from and what evidence do I have of biased imagery or language? And my question is, how reliable is the source for knowing about the events of the Reign of Terror? So for my 4-mark answer, my first point is going to be the source is created by an English cartoonist. If I just stop there, I don't get any marks. I have to explain. Therefore, it is less reliable because he is biased against the French. We could even say because they had been at war as a full answer about why he might be biased. And then my second point, I'm not going to talk about the date. I've got a choice. I've decided I want to talk about biased imagery. So I'm going to give a point about the way that this cartoon shows the biased imagery. And in this case, I'm going to say it's because the sans-culottes, I know that these are sans-culottes because we've got the long trousers, we've got this little liberty cap and the revolutionary rosette in the revolutionary colors. So I'm going to say, well, this person is shown as a caricature of a sans-culotte, as a monster in the form of a guillotine. And that is negative imagery and shows bias against the revolutionaries. So that's my justification for why I might say that the source is not as reliable for knowing about the events of the Reign of Terror. Now, if we've got a source that we think is actually reliable, this is a slightly more difficult thing to answer because, to be honest, all sources have got some degree of unreliability. There's nobody who ever creates a source who's going to be completely neutral, not have any kind of opinion. But we do get sources which clearly, like this source, are trying to push a very strong opinion. And then we get sources like this, these are some extracts from a book on the French Revolution by a historian called Simon Schama. He has opinions. He has views of what he thinks happened in the French Revolution. So he's not completely unbiased. But if we read the description here, this book attempts to confront directly the painful problem of revolutionary violence. Anxious lest they give way to sensationalism or be confused with counter-revolutionary prosecutors, historians have erred on the side of squeamishness in dealing with this issue. I have returned it to the center of the story, since it seems to me It was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of politics or the disagreeable instrument by which other more virtuous ends were accomplished. In some depressingly unavoidable sense, violence was the revolution itself. Now, this is not a completely neutral source. He's got some strong language like depressingly unavoidable, but on the whole, he's trying to present a more objective viewpoint about there was lots of violence in the revolution, and I'm going to try and understand that this wasn't just something that happened at the Reign of Terror, it's something that actually was all the way through the revolution. So if we feel like this is a bit more of a reliable source, and the question I've asked is how reliable is the source for knowing about the role of violence in the revolution? Because remember, the reliability is always about reliable for something specific. It's going to be different if we wanted to know, for example, for this source, how reliable is this source for knowing about what English people thought about the Reign of Terror in 1819? It's very reliable because it's from the time, it's from an English person, so that's going to be very reliable for us to know about English public opinion. But my question was here, how reliable is it for knowing about the events of the Reign of Terror itself? And then we're going to say, well, it's not so reliable for that. So you have to ask, what is it reliable for? In this case, we're going to say, this source is a secondary source from a respected historian, Simon Schama, which means it has the benefit of hindsight. So that phrase, the benefit of hindsight, is quite a useful one. It means that this person is looking back. In Schama's case, he was writing this book on the 200-year anniversary of the French Revolution. So he's got 200 years worth of sources and other historians' work and things to look back on. And he's able to pull all of that together to do his historical study. And then I've said here, it also does not make use of very emotive language. Again, this is a little bit of a weak point. Arguing for reliability is always a little bit more tricky. If I really didn't feel confident about this, I might also add on here my weakest point, which is the corroboration. The account Schama gives matches the other historical interpretations of the events. So as I say, that's always your weakest line of attack. If you really feel like, oof, I don't know if I've said enough here yet, I might just want to add something else in. This is still a valid interpretation, because when real historians are working with sources, if they find a source that says something completely different to everything else that they've read, they're going to stop and say, is this a trustworthy source? Whereas if the source kind of matches everything else that they're coming across, it's starting to add to the sense that the source might be more trustworthy. So those are how we engage with issues of reliability and unreliability.